This is Augie Macro with Cryptid Creatures. Today, rather than talking about a new cryptid, we will be revisiting the topic of an older one, which we discussed in Season 2, Episode 2, A Man-Eating Madness. Perhaps the most terrifying monster in all of cryptozoology, the Wendigo. The story of the Wendigo begins with the First Nation peoples and indigenous tribes of the northeastern United States and Canada, primarily the Cree of the northern Great Plains and eastern Canada, and the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes region, as well as other tribes within the Algonquin family. There are other stories similar to the Wendigo outside of this region, though, such as the Chanu, a creature described in Mohawk legend in what is now New York and New England, and the Wet'suwet'en, described by the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest and Western Interior. Considering these accounts, the Wendigo's range expands to encompass the entirety of the northern United States and Canada, from Newfoundland and Labrador, down to Pennsylvania, across to Oregon and Washington, and up to the Northern Territories. However, the Wendigo of the Great Lakes in eastern Canada is the most well documented, with the majority of accounts from history up to the modern day occurring in the area of Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Western Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Though regional tellings and spellings of the name vary, being referred to as Wendigo, Windigo, Wheatigo, Windgo, Weentigo, Wendago, Witico, Weejico, and so on, and the actual origin of the legend is unknown, the overall description of what the creature is fairly consistent. The Wendigo, according to oral tradition, is in fact a spirit, not a physical being, but appears to its victims as a tall, emaciated humanoid being, between 6 and 15 feet tall, with pale gray or white frostbitten skin, large glowing amber or orange eyes, long skeletal limbs, large claws, and razor-sharp predatory teeth. Its ribs are said to be exposed, its internal organs visible through decaying flesh, the hair on its head sparse or absent, and its lips gnawed or shriveled away. It is also said to have incredible strength, moving scarily fast on foot and through the trees, and in some accounts even be able to whistle or mimic the voices of people to lure in its victims. Some stories claim that the Wendigo spirit is connected to water, explaining the traditions surrounding many lakes, rivers, and beaches named after the creature, such as Lake Wendigo on the Leech Lake Indian Reservation in Cass County, Minnesota, Wendigo Beach near Lac de Bonnet in Manitoba, the Wendigo River in Quebec, and Wendigo Lake in Sawyer County, Wisconsin, which we visited in Season 2, Episode 2, A Man-Eating Madness. It is a being that embodies death, desolation, and the frozen wastes of the northern winter. Its heart is said to be made of ice, and its banshee-like screams can turn a man's blood cold. It is a dark spirit which exists to bring pain, suffering, and destruction to those it pursues. It is the personification of isolation and starvation, something all too familiar to a people that must endure the blizzards and harsh biting cold of the Great Lakes and the Canadian North. It stalks the dark forests and barren wastes in search of prey, motivated by a primal and unending hunger for flesh, human flesh. According to the oral traditions, to satisfy this hunger, it is said to possess human victims and take over their minds, compelling them to lose their humanity and submit to the depraved commands of the spirit. In doing so, the victim falls to the man-eating madness and is driven to brutal acts of murder and cannibalism. It finds human hosts who are already in a state of anguish, depression, or suffering, often harboring psychological illnesses or psychoses, targeting less sane or less stable people because they're easier to break and control. This being, however, is never satisfied, never full, growing hungrier the more it consumes, the more it kills. And so, it must move on and find more victims, beginning the cycle of gluttony and corruption again. It is a being that symbolizes what happens when all hope is lost to the bitter cold, the fine line between man and monster. This, of course, makes the Wendigo a most formidable creature among native legend. But it is also important to note the indigenous people's relationship with the story. The creature is not to be treated lightheartedly, and even the mentioning of its name is often discouraged or forbidden. According to local tradition, thinking about or talking about the Wendigo is enough to draw it near, and in combination with the fact that it is a personification of just about every major taboo in Algonquin society, it is not a creature that is often discussed or reported on. This is likely why there is so little information about early pre-Columbian reports, or the actual origins of the story itself, how far back it goes and what it's based on. To the indigenous and First Nation peoples, it is better not to engage it at all. As European settlers began to move into North America, the native stories began to disseminate among the new colonial arrivals. The first known record by Europeans on the Wendigo comes from 1661 by a French Jesuit missionary in New France, now Quebec, in his chronicles The Jesuit Relations, in which he compares the creature to European accounts of werewolves. From this, the modern add-ons to the story originate, where the being transitions from a spirit to a physical monster, and it acquires the power to transform its victims into other Wendigos, facilitating a lycanthrope vampire or zombie-like reproductive process. The appearance of the creature continued to change as the story entered the modern era, when we begin to see it depicted as a more animalistic or demonic entity, with large antlers or an elk skull for a head, and thick fur covering parts of its body. Though the exact moment this occurred is unknown, it is likely to do with the same European or Western Christian influences relating the Wendigo to demons, giving it horns and more bestial features. The modern Wendigo as we know it today comes from the 1910 supernatural horror novella The Wendigo, written by Algernon Blackwood, which tells the story of a hunting party venturing into the remote winter woods of northern Ontario, where they become the prey of the shape-shifting elusive spirit of the Wendigo. This story has been the inspiration for other subsequent works, such as the short story The Wendigo, from the iconically unsettling 1980s children horror short story collection, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, by Alvin Schwartz, and Stephen King's classic 1983 horror novel, Pet Sematary. The elk skull creature appears most notably in the 2001 psychological horror film Wendigo, directed by Larry Fessenden, about a family's upstate New York winter vacation gone horribly wrong. Since the release of this film, the admittedly inaccurate elk-headed Wendigo has become the most recognized form of the creature, capturing the imagination of the masses with its uniquely fearsome visage. It appears in Season 1, Episode 2 of the Warner Brothers TV series Supernatural in 2005, in Season 2, Episode 11 of the NBC supernatural drama Grimm in 2012, in the NBC TV show Hannibal as a representation of Dr. Hannibal Lecter's not-so-friendly side, and as the main antagonists in the survival horror video game Until Dawn, developed by Supermassive Games. In recent years, the idea of the Wendigo has taken a more scientific form, being interpreted not as a spirit or creature, but rather as a psychological disorder, dubbed Wendigo psychosis, which is characterized by anxiety, paranoia, and anorexia, which then leads into hallucinations, antisocial and violent behavior, and delusions of becoming a Wendigo, often ending in psychotic breakdown, cannibalistic urges, and homicidal and cannibalistic acts. Though this may sound far-fetched, there are actually multiple historic criminal cases, primarily in Canada but also in the US, of cannibalistic murders committed by unstable people who believed themselves possessed by the Wendigo. The most notable case of this is that of Swift Runner, a Cree trapper from Alberta who in the winter of 1878 butchered and ate his entire family, and confessed and was executed at the nearby Fort Saskatchewan. We discussed this account in Season 2, Episode 2, A Man-Eating Madness, and will be discussing the case in more detail later in the episode. Another famous case involved an Augie Cree medicine man named Jack Fiddler, who was tried in 1907 for the murder of multiple people who he believed were Wendigos, or who suffered from Wendigo psychosis. Jack subsequently committed suicide, and his brother Joseph was sentenced for life in prison, dying 3 years into his sentence. Wendigo psychosis, though used as a more scientific explanation for the Wendigo condition, is not officially recognized as the same sort of disorder as regular psychoses, and it's not recognized in the DSM-5, the 5th revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the standard text for recognized psychological conditions. It is believed rather to be a culture-bound disorder, being most common among First Nations and Indigenous peoples familiar with the Wendigo legend, or for people in modern cases, people who know the Wendigo legend from pop culture. This behavior actually seems to justify the traditional taboos around engaging the Wendigo legend. No wonder the indigenous tribes never spoke of the Wendigo, if the very idea truly has the potential to facilitate this man-eating madness. To learn more about the Wendigo legend, we had the opportunity to sit back down and talk with a former guest on Cryptid Creatures, who we talked with in Season 2, Episode 4, The Spirit of Lake Okanagan. Here is Canadian paranormal investigator, co-founder of the Canadian Paranormal Society, and author of Heart of Ice, Tracking the Wendigo, and creator of the YouTube documentary film Tracking the Wendigo, Jason Hewlett.
My name's Jason Hewlett. I'm the co-founder of the Canadian Paranormal Society up in British Columbia, Canada. And I'm also an author and documentary filmmaker, currently working with Small Town Monsters, who should be no stranger to any of your audience. And you can, I guess, most commonly find me at Jason Hewlett Official on Instagram, or you can find me on Facebook as Jason Hewlett. I've got the Sasquatch Legacy cover photo on my page.
How did you first get into the whole cryptid paranormal thing, and in this case, the Wendigo?
Well, the Wendigo actually is something, when I was a kid, I read a lot of comic books. And there's an issue of The Incredible Hulk where the Hulk is in Canada and he fights the Wendigo. And it's also the first appearance of Wolverine. Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing that. And in the comic, it was portrayed as like almost like a white Bigfoot kind of thing with a tail. But I thought it was like the coolest super villain I had ever seen, and would like draw my own Wendigo in the comics that I would draw as a kid and stuff like that. And it was only years later I realized it wasn't a comic book villain made up by Marvel Comics. It was a very real indigenous story up here in Canada about what happens when you basically consume another person. You're a cannibal, you turn into a Wendigo. And at that point I realized there's so much more to the story than just this simple monster.
Could you give me a brief explanation of like the origins of the story and just some of the general narrative of what the Wendigo is?
Yeah, like the Wendigo is really fascinating because it sort of started off as like a cautionary tale. And I think it is essentially a cautionary tale about what happens kind of when you act selfishly, take more than you need kind of thing. And it started off as something that if you did bad things, you were at risk of going Wendigo. And at that point, then you would start to see your loved ones and family as like food, basically, and then want to eat them. And it was almost like you were being taken over by this spirit or entity that would turn you into a cannibalistic monster. And it crossed over from indigenous story into Canadian criminal law with the story of Swift Runner, who was the first person legally hung in Western Canada. And he had essentially eaten his entire family, admitted to doing it, saying that a Wendigo was taking him over. He was arrested by the Northwest Mounted Police and hung at Fort Saskatchewan. And at the time when he was hung, he was ready to die because he was convinced he was going to be turned into a Wendigo. In fact, the guards at Fort Saskatchewan would be terrified of this large man in this tiny cell screaming that the Wendigo is trying to break into his prison and basically take him over. Um, and in 1910, a writer named Algernon Blackwood wrote a novella called The Wendigo. And that was the first time it was actually portrayed as a flesh and blood creature. Before that was like just an entity. So it transitioned into this monster, but not the monster that we're used to today. It was like almost like the rake, a tall, thin, skeletal figure. No horns. The antlers weren't there. Those kind of came in later on into the modern telling. So it's kind of this story that shifted over the course of its existence over thousands of years into this like kind of popular pop culture monster that we see today.
Yeah, I've always thought it was interesting that it went from the, the emaciated humanoid, almost undead sort of creature to this thing.
Yeah.
I like, how did that happen? Because I've personally speculated that it might have to do with just the fact that, that creature to a Western teller sounds like a demon. So maybe the ungulate sort of horned animalistic characteristics worked their way in through that, and just that was the best creepy indigenous looking thing that they could stick onto the head of this thing,
I think so. I remember talking with Sam Sheeran when I was writing the book, researching the book, and that's kind of what he said, is that it was kind of something over time when kind of religion would start to play more of a piece in it. The devil has horns, so it made sense that they would just sort of add that in. And in European stories, like the Wild Hunt was always depicted with people wearing helmets with horns on their heads. There were some indigenous tribes that did attribute the Wendigo to having horns. Sometimes it's spelled differently too. So there's sort of these different, like much like Sasquatch, each different race or nation has its own kind of spin on the story. So it was kind of like that, but you pretty much nailed it. And I think that was more in the 1930s on that you started to see the depiction of it with the horns. In fact, it's so rare now. Like the movie Antlers portrayed the Wendigo as a creature with horns, but the video game Until Dawn showed them more in the original system, but more like these rake-like creatures without the horns. I think that was really interesting that they worked that into the game. So, but pop culture says, yeah, if it's a Wendigo, it's got horns. And like sort of Swift Runner was like, I think the first time it really started to any real mention of it kind of came down into print. It was usually just like verbally passed on from generation to generation. And is in the book and in the film Tracking the Wendigo, Alicia Pearl Werner says it's something that they didn't even really talk about too much. If it came up, it was very hushed. You weren't supposed to say the word Wendigo because it would kind of cause it to come to you. And just even talking about it would associate it with that kind of evil presence. So that's hence like the exact origin can't be pinpointed really anywhere because there's nowhere written, is it really written down as this is the first time someone talked about the Wendigo. But you're talking like thousands of years.
Yeah.
The story's been around. I can surmise it when like the Swift Runner story and the Jack Fiddler story and even Marie Coutray, started to kind of get the interest of Northwest Mounted Police. And these things are sort of start being talked about amongst the European settlers, much like with Ogopogo. The story, like you tell someone a story and then they tell a story and it kind of becomes more emboldened and bigger. It just kind of changed with time. And then like when Algernon Blackwood's book attributed the Wendigo to being a monster, I think that just got worked into the narrative. And it's like now you see that with certain things like the whistling. Now they say, well, if you whistle in the dark, it's the Wendigo whistling, or taking other factors of like, trickster legends where the tricksters are supposed to like lure you out of your home or away from your campfire by like mimicking yourself or other people you hear. It's all these different stories that somehow now get mixed in with the Wendigo lore. And so one person sort of hears it and they start associating with it. Like when I was at the Canadian premiere of Cursed Waters, someone was telling me that a Wendigo had possessed a barn nearby. Well, Wendigos don't possess barns. You know what I mean? That just doesn't work that way. But people hear of something in the woods. that fits a descriptor of something, and they start attributing it to the Wendigo story, and that's just how the story grows. It's like the telephone game or whatever it was called, where you have like you just sort of pass on one story from one person to another. So it's one of those things that's just over the course of the last 150 years, really, it's just morphed somehow in pop culture, where this is what it is. You get something happens, you act in a certain way, the Wendigo takes you over, and you slowly turn into this large, hungry beast that just eventually just eats everyone around you and roams the woods until you basically burn out.
Mhm.
Like eat your own body till you're dead.
What's your opinion on the Wendigo? Do you think that it exists? What do you think it is if you do? Are there any personal experiences that you've had that might validate that?
The closest would have been while filming tracking the Wendigo, because we actually decided, because there was a sighting somewhere near where I lived. So my colleague Olivia Aslan and I decided to like put it to the test and do like our own investigation, which, people said we're kind of idiots, because if it's a real thing, we're screwed if we find it.
Yeah.
Like, what are you going to do if you find it, right? And that was kind of, we joke a bit about that. And we had some things happen during the investigation that kind of, and we treated it like a paranormal investigation. So we went out with trail cams on the assumption that it could be a physical thing. But we also started using like the trigger objects and such that we would use if we were ghost hunting to try to, if there was a spirit there. And we have what we call the UFO trigger object, which if it registers a change in heat temperature, it'll go off. So if you walk around it and everything, nothing's going to happen. But something went off, and it was like literally like 2 feet behind me, and it just sort of went off out of nowhere. And there's nothing around us, and the temperature was consistent. So that was interesting. And then we tried like the Estes method,
Hmm.
which basically someone plugs headphones into a spirit box, which is supposed to be a device used to communicate with spirits through electromagnetic frequency. And Ollie was wearing the headphones, and he couldn't see what I was doing, and I would ask questions. So he couldn't hear the question I'm asking, but he'd respond to whatever came up in the spirit box.
Hmm.
And I was asking a bunch of questions and nothing happened, and so I kind of paused for a while, and then he said, "Keep talking," because that's what he heard. So I asked, "Are there any like forest or Wendigo spirits out here who are hungry?" And the response was, "We are." So was that a Wendigo? I don't know. But I just
Yeah.
thought that was kind of interesting that
Mhm.
that came up, and he couldn't hear what I was saying, and I couldn't hear what was going on in the spirit box. So that mixed with the trigger object going off, maybe there was something out there. Um, as someone who started off on all this venture, who's like sort of in more of the realm of ghosts and spirits, I could see there being a spirit out there that potentially manipulate people.
Mhm.
I have not seen any giant antlered creatures roaming around in the woods, so I can't attest to that. So, when you sort of have to look at the facts and stick to the facts, but
Mhm.
people believe they're seeing something. And in Alberta, like spending time up in Alberta filming and researching the book, people out there take the story very seriously to this day. And so I can't poo-poo their belief system,
Yeah.
right? So if it exists, I think the spiritual component is definitely possible.
Mhm.
As a flesh and blood creature, I'm not sure. I just haven't seen one. People report seeing them, but I honestly haven't seen one, so I can't have a say on that one way or the other.
Whenever I was watching the documentary and you were doing all of the what are traditionally ghost finding methods,
Mhm.
I kind of had this thought in the back of my head. Imagine if you found evidence of ghosts, and instead of the Wendigo, it's like, oh, it's just a ghost.
Yeah.
You know?
Which that could be possible. We've been
Yeah.
up in that area before and had come across things in the woods, like ghosts in the woods. The presence of a gentleman who had died in a car accident. We came
Hmm.
across his spirit. So we were kind of aware that could happen. So that's like with the Estes, it was running that gamut. But when we got like the "Are you hungry?" and it's like we are, it's like, well, that fits into the Wendigo side of thing. Maybe it could have been a hungry ghost. I don't know. It's like one of those things.
Or it's like, hey, these guys are looking for a creepy creature. I'm gonna,
Yeah, let's
you know.
mess with them, right?
Yeah,
Like,
I mean if your spirit's been around for like hundreds of years, you might as well, you're bored probably.
yeah,
But
especially
not
in the middle of
not
the woods where nothing's happening, right?
not to
Like,
not to besmirch the method though. Um
no.
yeah.
This is all
Uh
working on theory in this line of work. Like it's all
yeah.
theory based, right? So you
Yeah.
do what you can. Hard Advice can be found through Small Town Monsters Publishing, via Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and it's just showed up on like at Walmart now. Like it's expanded. Barnes and Noble, books a million. Like it's kind of becoming more widely available that way, so you can definitely check it out through there. And it was funny because after Cursed Waters and Legend of Ogopogo, I just had a lot of time on my hands.
Mm,
I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with it, so I started researching a bunch of different topics. The Wendigo is one of them. The Cadborosaurus was another one,
mm,
which is a sea monster off the coast of British Columbia. And I was chatting with Eli Watson about Cursed Waters because we were getting ready to go to Monster Fest, and the movie was getting completed, so we had a bunch of kind of post-production meetings. And halfway through one of the meetings, he's like, "What book are you writing next?" And I just went, "The Wendigo, something about the Wendigo." Like I just sort of picked it like right there and then.
mm,
And he was really excited because STM was in the early stages of talking about putting together a film project about the Wendigo. And so
mm,
I talked to Heather Mosier, who's like one of the producers and writers and researchers there about it, and she got excited. And so they decided right there they wanted to do the Wendigo book
mm.
and tie it into some kind of film project at some point. And originally it was going to be part, they have like their Cryptid Goatman
Yeah.
run and there's Cryptid Chupacabra. It was originally going to be like Cryptid Wendigo. And then Eli didn't want to make a Cryptid Wendigo movie. And he eventually sort of moved on.
Mm,
And so they decided they were going to do a film. And it originally, like, I think Seth at one point was going to come up to Canada and do it. And that was going to fall apart. And so it was literally like last April, even no, last March, so almost a year ago. Seth's like, "Well, how do you feel about making the Wendigo documentary? And you'll have the book and everything like that." And I just sort of said, "Sure."
mm,
That sounds great, actually. I'd really like to do that. Because when I'd gone to research the book the previous year up in Alberta, I'd taken my camera with me and just started shooting it, thinking it could be used in some project.
mm,
So I had a bunch of footage, and then I had to kind of film some more stuff, which is like the wraparound, the investigative stuff, and then connect the pieces of the all the stories together,
mm.
and did some additional interviews, sort of via Zoom, etc., and just put the movie together while finishing the book, basically. And so that's why if you read the book, there's a lot of material in there that's in the documentary, but there's stuff in
Mm,
the documentary that's not in the book.
mm,
And there's stuff that was originally going to be in the documentary from the book that I cut out because the original cut was more than 3 hours long, and that was just too long for something about the Wendigo.
mm.
So they both can be kind of enjoyed on their own entity, but if you read it and watch it, it kind of tells you the full story.
What was it like on location at some of those places? Like I remember that one cemetery, and the place where Swift Runner was.
Hmm.
Different on location places like that. What was that like?
That was fascinating. Like to actually go like to the Tuatna Valley, which is where Swift Runner is supposed to have killed his
Mm,
family, and where all the bodies were found, and this horrible, horrible crime scene. You really got to feel like we were there in May, and obviously it's in modern times, so there's more people than there would have been in like the 1890s, but not that much more.
mm,
And you really felt like you're in the middle of nowhere. Like, and so you could actually really, it would make sense. Like, it's not hard to fathom something like that actually happening, some horrible crime like that. And just the isolation of it. And to add in, like, if you went there in the middle of winter when it's like minus 50 degrees Celsius and there's like feet of snow on the ground, like you're alone. So you could kind of feel like if you were like the members of that family, this horrible thing was going on, you were helpless. There's nothing you could do. And that sense really came across being there. And at the same time, it was really peaceful because it's like this quiet place in the middle of nowhere, right? So that was really fascinating. The cemetery up at Slave Lake, like where
mm,
Marie Coutret's body was supposed to be buried somewhere around there, that was really neat. And just sort of to just how historic it all is up there. And then the Fort Saskatchewan, even though it's like a recreation, like literally moved like a few feet over from where the original
mm,
site was, but it was an exact recreation. It's just like going back in time. Like you could just, the story suddenly become a whole lot more alive.
mm,
And you see just how much the Wendigo and the related stories to it are a part of Alberta's history. Like Father Lacombe, who was one of the people that first took Swift Runner, and there's a whole community called Lacombe,
mm,
Alberta, right? Like it's so entrenched in the culture and the history of that province that it's a real Canadian story, even though
mm,
like there's sightings all the way down into the eastern United States, but it's a very Canadian story, and it was neat to kind of trace that,
mm.
the
Yeah.
origins of it.
I've always found that you can't beat going to the place.
No,
Like
no,
I
you can't.
like I've talked about how, for the Mothman, because on Cryptid Creatures, we've extensively looked at the Mothman myth, and just going to the TNT area, to the McClintock Wildlife Management area where the creature's supposed to live. Like it's creepy enough in the day. It definitely has a vibe to it, and like we took a drone up for season 2, episode 3, the return of the Mothman. We went back and were filming with a drone over the TNT area, and like you can see where they built canals, uh, like to move water about, and like where the igloos are, where they used to store munitions, and the story comes to life whenever you go to the place.
It does.
I can
Yeah.
definitely attest to that.
Yeah.
Um,
You can't beat it. It just brings everything alive. And then I find as someone who's documenting it, you can relate to it more,
yeah.
which helps in the final product, really. When we were doing filming Wendigo,
Hmm.
there's an opening bit where we were just filming in the house and leaving, and I had to get Ollie to come out of his room. I wanted just to shoot him walking out the door of his
Yeah.
room. And so it's like it was staged, but it was going to happen anyways. But I'm just, okay, Ollie, what I'll do is I'll just yell like action and just walk out of your room.
Hmm.
And I yelled like, okay, camera's rolling, action. And like I'm waiting. And he's not coming. I'm like, dude, are you coming out of your room? And he's like, I'm laughing too hard. So that's why in the film when he and I are talking, and I'm like, okay, let's go, and he yells cut.
Hmm.
That's why he yelled cut, because just to make fun of me when I said action. Then we all
Yeah.
started laughing. Sean had to turn the camera off because we were all laughing so hard
Yeah.
in the woods.
The giggles are a troublesome thing when you're on
Yeah,
camera.
they're a thing. They're a real thing.
Yeah.
I love the story.
Mm.
I love the story, and it was so great to actually film, be able to have the honor of being able to make a documentary about a subject I've been fascinated with since I was a kid was just like a dream come true.
Mm.
So when Seth's like, do you want to make it? And I'm like, sure, and to be able to kind of, in a way, adapt my own book. How often does that happen? You get to write a book about it, and then you kind of almost get to adapt your own book into the film.
And you sort of done that twice. Because like both of these books go along with the documentaries
Yeah.
they like. I mean, you did it once. That's cool. You did it again. That's even cooler.
Yeah, and the first time it was Eli's movie, which was great, and Eli did an
Yeah.
awesome
Yeah.
job. So that was great, and to be able to do that, so that kind of became the template for Heart of Ice. But when I started writing Heart of Ice, I didn't know how it was going to finish, and I didn't think I was going to
Hmm.
actually make a film about it. And then they're like, "Yeah, you can make the movie too," and I was like, "Sweet, yeah, that sounds fantastic."
Yeah.
Uh, so that yeah, to do it twice, I don't know. We'll see if there's a third time. Third time's the charm kind of thing or not.
If you did that again, what do you think you'd want to do it on? Like what is the one story that, like, aside from these two, you've always wanted to talk about?
That's the thing. Like I know with Ape Island, I mean, I love Sasquatch, so it's going to be definitely the book will be related. It is related to all that,
Hmm.
and my intention is to make a good chunk of the book, whatever happens with Alex and I on the island.
Hmm.
So I guess that'll kind of be the third time. Although it'll be his film plus me making a side documentary project. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But when you start any of these, you have no idea
Yeah.
how it's going to go, right? Because
Hmm.
I'm not interested in just writing a nonfiction book where I just spend the whole time sitting in here just interviewing people and then putting it into a book. Like I like the idea of going out and partaking in an adventure that becomes a component of the book. Because I
Hmm.
think for readers, and the feedback I've got is that makes it more interesting than just reading a book that's just here's all the information from,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, and that's it. Like I
It's
think if you can live
informational.
something, it makes it more interesting.
It's informational, and it's an adventure story, and it's true.
Yeah, and that's
It's
the
the
three
perfect
components
storm.
together I
Yeah.
really like. Yeah, it's the perfect storm. That's what I like to read when I read nonfiction. I like all three of those components to be in there. So
Hmm.
it's not just an academic textbook. It's a living, breathing adventure story that's true.
Are you working on any other projects right now? Because, like, obviously I'm a fan. So,
Yes, I am. So I just had another documentary called Sasquatch Legacy come out from them
mhm.
in December. And then Alex Petikoff is working on a Journey to Ape Island film. They've announced
Okay.
that already. And actually, I'm working with him on that. And he and I are going to be going to Vancouver Island and really taking a deep dive into the Sasquatch lore in and around Vancouver Island. So there will be like a main film about that. There'll be like a couple specials around it, and there is a book going to be about it as well that I'm working on kind of right now in the early stages. And depending when this comes out, there'll be a lot more announced, obviously, in the Kickstarter
Mhm.
sort of campaign that they've got going. But that's the big one that Alex and I are a part of, and I'm really excited to work with Alex on it. Like he and I have chatted many times, and I've been a fan of Bigfoot Beyond the Trail and Strange Places, and our method of documenting things is very similar. So I think we're going to have a really exciting time on Vancouver Island,
Mhm.
diving deep into Sasquatch lore there, like Alert Bay and Muchalot Harry and that kind of stuff.
What's your favorite aspect of the Wendigo story? Like, do you have a specific account that you've heard from a person that you've interviewed, or like a historical account, or like just some feature of the story that, just is unique to you? Like, is there anything in particular that you find so fascinating about it?
I think the fact that it's endured so much and that it's changed with time, I think that's really interesting. I think it shows like the Sasquatch stories have pretty much stayed Sasquatch stories, right? And
Hmm.
I think Sasquatch is fascinating. Even like lake monsters like Loch Ness Monster and Ogopogo, they've kind of remained pretty consistent. But the Wendigo has like, as time's gone on, it's almost like changed with the times.
Hmm.
Um, and I think just the fact it's one of the few, because technically people classify it as a cryptid, but like Mothman, there's another layer to it,
Hmm.
like a supernatural layer to it. And I'm fascinated by the fact that there's just nothing good about the Wendigo. Like, there's nothing positive about it at all. It's a horrible horror story that has many times crossed over into Canadian criminal law. And I think that doesn't happen very much with any of these things. Like,
Yeah.
right? I think that's even like back in like the with Vince Lee in the mid to late 2000s when he murdered his companion on a Greyhound bus and started eating him and cutting off pieces and putting him in a bag. That was attributed to the Wendigo. And I just think that to me, that just the fact that it crosses over into true crime so often, it just completely not baffles. It intrigues me so much, especially having been a crime reporter,
Hmm.
newspaper crime reporter for 10 years. So I like that. I don't can't say that's a nice aspect of it, but it's one that fascinates me and just
Yeah.
I think it makes the Wendigo unique. I thank you for the interest in it. And
Hmm.
you know, it's kind of keeping it like this is kind of a story like when did the book and the film came out in October and people are still talking about it and are still interested in it. And I think it just shows how this is such a fascinating subject
Hmm.
within the cryptid community, right?
If you were to speak to an up and coming cryptid researcher, paranormal researcher, someone who wants to get into this, what sort of advice would you give?
I can't remember how I answered the last time. I think it might have been like, make sure if you really want to do this, you do it the right way. So try to find people who are also have been doing it for a while
Mm.
and are interested in it and treat it as more than just a thrill seeking venture. Especially like, I mean, if you want to go into the woods and look for Wendigo or Bigfoot, there's a lot of things that can go wrong that have nothing to do with finding a Wendigo or a
Yeah.
Bigfoot. Like the woods can be very dangerous places. So you want to know what you're doing and go with people who know what they're doing. And that just for your own personal safety.
Mm.
Um, but then just do as much research as you can,
Mm.
like and treat the stories with the respect they deserve. Because I find it's when you go in not respecting them, and you're like thrill seeking, or you're going to become aggressive and try to demand like results. You know what I mean? It never ends well for
Hmm.
people who do that. It can go really, really wrong. And you hear stories of people who don't respect the Sasquatch story that go looking for trouble, and they sure find it,
Mm.
and it's not fun. So find people who know what they're doing, do the proper research, take the proper precautions, and always approach the subject with respect.
Check out Jason Hewlett's Heart of Ice, Tracking the Wendigo, and the documentary Tracking the Wendigo on YouTube. Thank you for your interview. I really appreciate it. It's good to have you back on the show.
It was great to come back, Augie. Thanks so much for having me, and it was great to talk about like basically my one of my favorite all-time favorite cryptid stories with you.
Hmm. Cut. What is the Wendigo? Is it simply an oral tradition turned psychotic disorder? Is it a nightmarish demonic creature, bloodthirsty for human prey? Is it like werewolves, something that can infect and transform its victims into other monsters, spreading like some diabolical virus in the northern wastes? Or is it really what the indigenous stories say it is? A dark spirit, a personification of greed and isolation and desperation, of starvation, of fear, of depravity and violence, of frost, of death itself? Is it more than just a man-eating madness, something ancient and eternal, something not to be found but to be left alone, something to respect and fear, an embodiment of the frozen north itself, forged in blood and ice? We may never know. Thanks for watching, and to watch our previous and future episodes, visit the Cryptid Creatures YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and tell your friends. Cryptid Creatures is brought to you by the Kitty Petters Union, Cobble Sound Recording Company, and my dad's show, Meet the Pressers. This is Cryptid Creatures with Augie Macro, signing off.